All right, welcome back to the Forecast Contest webinar webcast series. My name is David Margold, and I'm today's host. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest speaker and friend, Dr. Nathaniel Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a research scientist at GFDL, where his research focuses on, let me see if I can get this right, climate dynamics, with particular interest in subseasonal and seasonal climate variability and predictability, climate prediction, tropical extratropical interaction, and atmospheric teleconnection patterns. That's a mouthful there. In addition, Dr. Johnson oversees GFDL's real-time seasonal forecast efforts with the North American, or NMME. Nat is also a member of NOAA's El Niño-Southern ENSO seasonal forecast team and a regular writer for the NOAAclimate.gov ENSO blog. And I've read some of those posts and they're great. So for today's webcast, Dr. Johnson will speak to his research on tropical forcing signals, such as the MJO, including their predictability and their impacts on global weather. Without further ado, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dave. It's wonderful to be here. And so I'm happy to share some of my work I've done related to tropical forcing tools for subseasonal prediction. And so first, I just want to give some context related to my early career journey. So I got my PhD in meteorology at Penn State University in 2009. And shortly after that, I moved 5,000 miles away, started a postdoc at the University of Hawaii. So it's good work if you can get it. And it's, so shortly before I left Penn State, I started collaborating with scientists at the Climate Prediction Center at NOAA. And so that was really when I started my work. I kind of blended predictability prediction with operational predictions. And so, what I'm going to talk about today is some of the work that was rooted in that early work when I was at Hawaii. Just as a side, by the way, at the bottom right, this is me at the summit of Mauna Loa. So I guess I probably wouldn't be able to do that hike today. Just recently in the news, Mauna Loa just erupted for the first time since 1984. But yeah, these are some of the scenes from Hawaii. It's just remarkable diversity in terms of even in climate. So from very wet to very dry. Anyway, it's a wonderful place to be. And also a very fruitful for my research. So I'm just going to give so just a brief primer on the MJO and ENSO. I'll note that Michael Ventrice's webinar has more information on this, so I recommend that you check out his webinar as well. But so the Madden-Julian Oscillation, or MJO, it's the dominant mode of subseasonal variability in the tropics. And what it describes is areas of organized anomalous convection that slowly propagates eastward across the tropics over the course of about 30 to 60 days. So and typically we divide the MJO into 8 nominal phases that describe this eastward progression. So you can see, in phase 2, we have this anomalous convection in the Indian Ocean, slowly progressing eastward through the tropics. And each phase typically lasts between about 5 to 8 days, but it can vary. So we don't always have this regular eastward progression of the MJO. But what's important is that the MJO excites these teleconnection patterns that have a really important influence on weather in downstream areas, including North America, particularly in the winter. And the El Niño-Southern Oscillation, the ENSO, is the MJO is the dominant mode of tropical variability on subseasonal timescales, whereas ENSO is dominant on seasonal timescales. So it's closely tied to the sea surface temperature anomalies in the equatorial Pacific. So in El Niño, we have anomalously warm conditions in the eastern equatorial Pacific. Essentially, the warm pool shifts eastward, so the anomalous convection in the central equatorial Pacific, and for the stronger events, it even extends farther east into the eastern Pacific. Anomalous subsidence, the maritime continent, and a weakened Walker circulation. Whereas for La Nina, we have the opposite. And again, we typically see some important impacts of ENSO over North America. I'm showing the typical La Nina winter pattern because we've had La Nina for each of the past 2 winters, and it looks like we're going into the 3rd winter of La Nina. So typically, we have drier and warmer conditions in the southern and eastern part of the U.S., wetter near the Ohio Valley, Pacific Northwest, colder over the northern tier of the U.S. And so this is also an important pattern for our subseasonal prediction. So going back to the MJO, there's a lot of research between, say, the years 2005, 2010 that really solidified the impact of the MJO on the extratropical circulation. And in my research, but a lot of this research really focused on the impact on timescales of 2 weeks or less, and that makes sense because typically that's the timescale where convective forcing in the tropics is going to impact the extratropics. But one thing that I found that was kind of motivated some of the later work I did is that I found that the MJO impact on the atmospheric circulation can extend to lags beyond 2 weeks. And one of the studies that first really documented this is this Riddle et al. Paper we wrote in 2013. And so what we did is we classified the wintertime atmospheric circulation into 7 dominant patterns of 500 millibar height anomalies. So these 7 clusters are patterns that they basically minimize the distance within cluster, but maximize the distance between clusters. So you could think of every weekly 500 millibar height field can be classified into the best matching pattern. And we can see that there are some very, projections onto our canonical teleconnection patterns like the PNA and the NAO. And I'm just going to zoom in on one particular pattern. So this is an example. This is cluster pattern 6. You can see it's like a positive PNA pattern mixed with a negative NAO. And typically when this pattern occurs, we see cooler temperatures in the eastern US, warmer temperatures in the west. And what we find is that the MJO can influence the frequency of occurrence of this pattern for lags out to almost 4 weeks. So what I'm showing here on the right, on the x-axis, this is the lag with respect to the MJO phase. So we have each of the 8 MJO phases, and these bars in each plot represent the anomalous frequency of occurrence. So a value of 100 would mean that the pattern is twice as frequent as it normally is. So for example, if a pattern normally occurs 15% of the time in climatology, a value of 100 means that it occurs 30% of the time. And the colors mean that these values are statistically significant. And so what we see is that, for example, after MJO phase 5, about 20 to 25 days later, this pattern occurs more frequently than normal. And phase 6, it shifts to lower lag, so 5 to 20 days, et cetera. So this suggests that MJO gives information on pattern occurrence, more 10 to 25 days in advance. I also note that this is just based on the current state of the MJO. So the assumption is that there's an extratropical response that's already baked in based on what the MJO has been doing previously or and the state it's in now, regardless of what it's forecast to do in the future. Although, I'm sure some of these values of these longer lags are based on the assumption that the MJO is going to have a fairly typical evolution. So if you see something, the forecast is expecting something that's very atypical, then I might not trust some of these values at the longer lags. But from 3 weeks in, so this is really based on the signal that we've seen in the recent MJO. Okay, so going back to these 7 patterns, we found that there were basically 3 patterns that had a strong response to the MJO. So cluster 4, so you can see this is a negative NAO-like pattern. And you look at MJO phase 6, we see this anomalous frequency of occurrence, about 15 to 25 days later, and then it shifts to the shorter lags. So you go to phases 7 and 8. Cluster 6 is what I just showed in the previous slide. Cluster 7 is more of a kind of a negative PNA-like pattern. So this is more responding to the MJO phases 1 through 3. You can see this anomalous frequency of occurrence. And just to see, show how this might apply to the current situation. So, so recently we've seen a more highly amplified MJO phase 7 that's transitioned to MJO phase 8. If you were to look at those cluster patterns, you find that the pattern that most strongly excited by phases 7 and 8 is this cluster 4. You can see this negative NAO-like pattern. So, about 5 to 20 days after MJO phase 7, we see this, enhanced frequency of occurrence to this pattern. Signal's a little bit weaker phase 8, but still it's generally the same sort of behavior, shifting to shorter lags. And then if you looked at the recent, day 16 to 20, 500 millibar height forecast, both the ECMWF and CFS, you can see there's really actually a pretty close correspondence between what's forecast in the dynamical models with its cluster pattern. Actually, I think quite lucky that the correspondence is as good as it is. So normally I wouldn't expect it to be so good, but you could see, the projection, this map projection is a little different, but you could clearly see this negative NAO-like pattern. Even some of the details over the North Pacific and the EC are kind of similar with the positive heights over, just west of the Aleutians. Kind of see that in the EC and maybe to a lesser extent the CFS. But that doesn't mean this is actually what's going to occur, but it does suggest, maybe there's some physical basis for why we see this in the forecast that, linked to what's going on in the tropics. So kind of the next step after this study was to kind of apply these ideas to develop probabilistic North American temperature forecasts, focusing on weeks 3 and 4, based on these empirical relationships with the MJO, ENSO, and the linear trend. So basically, we generated forecasts that were, the same format that the Climate Prediction Center typically produces, which are 3 category forecasts: below, near normal, and above average, based on these tercile boundaries within the distribution. So basically what we did is we just looked at the combined influence of the MJO, ENSO, and linear trend to see how that shifts the distribution. And then we assumed a Gaussian distribution. And from that, we were able to generate, these probabilities of above, near normal, or below average temperatures. And so I'll give you an example here. This is when I came up with this example, I wasn't thinking the relevance to the current situation, but it turns out this is quite relevant because currently we're in La Nina conditions and we just kind of recently transitioned to MJO phase 8. So this could be relevant to the current situation. But so on the left here, this would be a forecast for week 3 temperatures when we have La Nina. MJO is in phase 8. And again, the forecast showing the probabilities of being in the below average category. So the lower tercile are the cold colors and the warm colors are the probabilities of being above average. This middle column here, this is the mean Heitke skill score. So Heitke skill score is one way that its Climate Prediction Center often evaluates forecasts. Basically, positive values mean that the forecast is better than a random forecast. And the stippling in the middle shows that there's a significant skill. And then on the top right here, this is the composite 500 millibar height anomalies for this forecast. So what we can see, for this forecast, it's generally tilted the odds towards below average temperatures, much over the lower 48. Significant skill over a good part of the US, particularly over the West and the eastern half of the US. And looking at the 500 millibar height anomalies, you can see this ridge over the North Pacific, this kind of a negative PNA-like pattern, which is very typical of La Nina, which is normally not a cold signal for the, particularly over the Southeast US, but it's, kind of compensated by this negative NAO shifted to the West. That helps to maintain this sort of cool signal over the US, which according to the Heitke skill score is something that verifies rather frequently. Looking at a couple other examples. So week 3 forecast, we have El Nino and the MJOs in phase 2. It's kind of a more of a warm signal over much of the northeastern US. And again, looking at the circulation, typical, El Nino deep in dilution low over the south central US. Week 4 forecast for neutral ENSO, MJO phase 6, another example that's kind of like the week 3 La Nina MJO phase 8 forecast, so cooler at the ridge over, just east of the Aleutians, but a low over much of the eastern part of the US and negative NAO-like pattern. So these are just a couple of examples. If we look at the Heitke skill scores, for all week 3 and week 4 periods in the wintertime, based on this just simple empirical model. So on the left here, this is forecast just based on the MJO and the trend. And the middle is the ENSO and trend. And then the right is when you combine them all. So for week 3, you can see the MJO influence is useful for a good portion of the Western US and Northeastern US. And so stronger skill over, areas in the South Central, like Southern Texas, Pacific Northwest, less skill over, the heart of the US and the Northeast. But you combine the impacts, pretty good coverage over the US. Maybe you're out of luck right over the central US. Week 4, the MJO influence is reduced, but the ENSO influence is persistent. And so the skills scores reduce somewhat, but you still have some decent coverage where there's skill from this empirical model. And so this is covering all phases of the MGO, but there are certain phases where we might expect a stronger signal. And so there have been studies suggesting that, if we have an east-west dipole of convective heating, so one year 80 east, one year 160 degrees east, the response tends to reinforce each other. So for example, if we have enhanced convection in the Indian Ocean and suppressed convection over the Western and Central Pacific, that dipole is going to lead to a stronger response than if you just have anomaly in one spot or the other spot. And so that generally corresponds with, MJO phases 3 and 7. And so this is looking at the skill scores, the spatial mean Heike skill scores over North America, sorted by MGO phase on the x-axis, and then lead time on the y-axis. And generally, you can see some general agreement with this idea that certain phases you get better skill. So some of the highest skill is after MGO phases 7, between 15 and 25 days. Some good skill at those shorter leads from phase 3, but actually it extends to, phase 1, about 20 to 25 days, and then less skill in between. So it suggests that, maybe there are certain forecasts of opportunity where you expect a better MJO forecast skill. And, and this is, I think, in agreement with some of the MJO tools that have been developed for the subseasonal forecast contest. So really, I think overall consistent with some of the MJO analog tools that have been developed. I won't go into details here. Sorting by La Nina, neutral, ENSO, El Nino. There's some shifts, but overall similar kind of story. Look at the different ENSO phases. Okay, so after doing this research, I decided I'm going to write another proposal to NOAA. And so at the time, we had this gap in NOAA's climate outlook. So nothing in weeks 3 and 4. So NOAA had the 6 to 10, the 8 to 14 day outlook, the monthly outlook, the seasonal outlook, but nothing in weeks 3 and 4. And my argument was that we have a scientific basis to fill that gap. And so wrote a proposal focused on filling that gap. And so shortly after submitting that proposal, President Obama had this initiative calling on NOAA to extend the outlooks to 15 to 30 days. So even though it's not true, I'd like to think that maybe the president came across my proposal while I was in review and said, that's a good idea. So came out with this initiative. But since, although, yeah, I don't think that's the real case, it certainly is helpful for getting your proposal funded if the president comes out with an initiative that's calling on NOAA to do exactly that. So so that helped. So starting in 2014, so we began transitioning this kind of empirical forecast tool to guidance for CPCs, what was then the new week 3-4 outlook. And so this is an example of the tool. So this is based on just multiple linear regression that captures the influence of the MJO, ENSO, and trend. So there are just 4 predictors in this regression. So you have the 2 MJO indices, RMM1, RMM2, the Niño 3.4 SST as a measure of ENSO, and the linear trend. And with that tool, this is the kind of guidance that they develop at CPC. So for example, this is showing the forecast on the top left. And they can look at it in terms of the forecast anomaly, or on the bottom left, this is the probability. I'll note that I showed 3 category forecasts in development, but eventually the tool, the week 3-4 outlook is now a 2 category forecast, so just above or below normal. But so the forecaster can look at the forecast and also look at the contributions from the different factors. So the top and the middle at the top is the MJO influence. So this is a case where the MJO clearly has a warm influence over the eastern half of the U.S. ENSO is, on the bottom center, and then the trend influence on the bottom right. And then on the top right, this is the historical skill. So it's just showing where this influence, where this forecast would typically be more skillful. So that gives forecasters some indication of how confident he or she should be in this particular forecast. And you could also look at, weeks 3 and weeks 4 separately. And also the forecaster can step through potential future evolutions of the background state. So for example, MJO phase 1, how would it look if, we have confidence in how MJO is going to evolve into phase 2 or phase 4, phase 6. So these are the kinds of tools that help to inform the week 3, 4 outlooks that the CPC forecasters can use. But again, it's a pretty simple statistical model, linear regression for predictors. And here's just an example of a recent example of how you can see how this sort of guidance is incorporated into the week 3, 4 temperature outlook. So this is a recent forecast issued less than 2 weeks ago, and valid December 3rd to the 16th. So, we're approaching the verification period. And what I can say, this doesn't look like a terrible forecast. But if you were to read the forecast discussion, you would read this part. It says this week 3, 4 forecast is based on a blend of statistical model guidance that incorporates ENSO, the MJO, the long-term trend, and the PNA as predictors, along with dynamical model output from the ECMWF, GFS, CFS, ECC, GMA, and SubX multi-model ensemble suites. More weight was given to the statistical models, given 1, the relative better performance in the dynamical models over recent forecasts, and 2, robust MJO forcing that is expected to occur in the context of ongoing La Nina background conditions. So here's an example where they're weighing all the guidance. They're not just putting all their faith in statistical guidance, they're also looking at dynamical guidance. But in this case, they felt a little bit more confident in the statistical guidance, and so that was informing their outlook. And just to give examples of these regression coefficients that go into the weeks 3, 4 outlook. So this is for just DJF. On the top here, this is the 500 millibar height coefficients, and the bottom is the temperature. So first, look at the 500 millibar height, the Niño 3.4. So this shows the kind of the typical ENSO pattern. So when we have El Nino, we have a stronger than average Aleutian low shifted a bit to the east, below average heights over the southern US, above average heights over much of Canada. The regression coefficients for the RMM1 index also shows a deep and Aleutian low and positive anomalies over much of the Arctic. But RMM2, we see more of a signature over the North Atlantic, so more of a negative NAO-like pattern. And this pattern actually closely resembles that cluster 4 that I talked about from the Riddle et al. Study. And for the trend, you can see a weaker signature, particularly Arctic and over the North Pacific. The temperature regression coefficients. So again, the ENSO, this is a kind of a typical ENSO signal. So El Nino warmer than average over the northern tier of the North America, below average of the South Central US. RMM1, so positive values of RMM1, typically cooler than average temperatures over the northeastern US, above average over the West. RMM2, stronger signal over much of the eastern US. So, and again, going back to the phase diagram. So RMM2 would be values that are, phases 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's just on average in this top half, positive values, you tend to have cooler than average conditions over the eastern US in weeks 3 and 4. And so if you wanted to say, for example, the coolest signal over the Northeast, it would be positive RMM1, positive RMM2. So that you're talking about MJO phases 5 and 6. And I think this, again, it agrees pretty well with the MJO analog tools that have been developed at the statistical forecast contest. So remember, this is covering a full 2-week period. So if you're going to hone in on just days 16 to 20, it's going to be shifted a little bit, more this maybe like phases 7 and 8 and a little bit more concentrated. And of course, it'd be the opposite. So if 5 and 6 is a cool signal over the Northeast, then rotate 180 degrees, 1 and 2 would be warmer signal over the Northeast. And the trend in DJF, not so big of an influence, except in the Arctic regions, more influential in some of the other seasons. But this is just an example. So just to give an idea of the kind of general relationships you might see from these separate influences. And then you might wonder, well, how well does, if you just use the statistical guidance, how does it compare to some of the other forms of guidance, the dynamical guidance in particular? So here I'm showing the performance over the September 2015 to September 2020 period. So this is now covering all seasons, so not just isolating DJF, but so this MLR, this is the statistical model I've been describing. To the left of here is the dynamical guidance, so the CFS, ECMWF, JMA. We'll ignore the PM, but and the right here is the official CPC outlook. And overall, I'd say that the statistical guidance is at least competitive with the performance of the dynamical guidance. So a little bit better than CFS, a little bit worse than ECMWF. JMA has actually surprisingly done quite well during this period. But overall, it's not that dissimilar. Looking at it spatially, again, similar in terms of coverage with the dynamical guidance, did quite well in Alaska, but over the lower 48, pretty similar to patterns as with the dynamical guidance. And then the question is, how similar is the statistical and dynamical guidance? And this I thought was quite interesting. So the correlations between the MLR model with the dynamical guidance. And there's some regions where there's positive correlations, but overall the correlations are actually quite small. So what this is suggesting to me is that the performance is, even though the performance is competitive, the information is often quite independent. So they're not going to agree all the time, even though they're performing pretty similarly. So this was the kind of the main points that I wanted to cover. So what I find is that the combined influence of the MJO, ENSO, and linear trend has a significant lag impact on U.S. temperatures more than 2 weeks in advance. And so for the winter time, as I showed, MJO phases 5 through 8 generally drive cool conditions to weeks 3-4 for the east. Whereas phases 5 or 6 are the coolest signal overall, and phases 1 to 2 will be the warmest. And as I discussed, the statistical subseasonal forecast guidance is competitive in performance with some of the leading dynamical guidance, but it often provides independent information. And that's I think something that I think is worth exploring more. So it's something that I would like to understand a little bit better. And some of the general advice that I would give based on this line of work. So one thing I suggest is to test ideas by building and then evaluating models. And that's something that I think is really very much in the spirit of subseasonal forecast contest. But we uncover relationships that look promising or predictions. That's great. Now try to incorporate that into a model and see how well you can make predictions. And that's I think ultimately one of the best ways to kind of vet the ideas you have. And the other really second piece of advice I give is just to start simple. So what I've described is very simple. It's a multiple linear regression. So haven't considered potential different flavors of the MGO, haven't considered different flavors of the ENSO, haven't considered potential nonlinear relationships. But the reason there are many reasons why I suggest starting simple. So first of all, simple is easy to implement and easy to interpret, and sometimes it can perform quite well. And I think I've provided evidence of that. Another reason is that sometimes these simple models provide useful benchmarks for the more complicated models. So if you want to justify adding complexity, demonstrate that you can outperform some of the simpler models. And another, just a practical reason, is that a lot of times the data we have available for building these models really allow limited complexity. So I found, in my research, sometimes I've done complicated analyses and tried to build complicated models, but I find that, you know, the more complicated it is, the more data you need to get robust estimates of the parameters in your model. And sometimes you just don't have enough data to work with. And so, reverting to a simpler model where, you know, it might not have all the complex relationships that you want, but it has more, more accurate estimate of the parameters you are trying to build, and actually may perform better. And that's not to say that simpler is, something as simple as what I've described today is all you need, because I have, I've done more complicated diagnostics and incorporated more complex statistical methods that have been promising. It's just that the bar is a little bit higher when you're trying to make something more complex. So I think I will stop there for now and see if I have any questions that they might have, or follow-ups to what I've described today.
Nat, I think that was great. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, fortunately, you kind of asked, I think, some of the questions that we had in terms of boiling this all down in terms of how to use this with the dynamic guidance. Does it provide independent information? You answered that question, and I'm glad to see, as someone who actually uses this stuff, a lot of these MGO statistical tools like you have, and you guys you have developed. I'm glad to see that there's still a lot of value there, which tells me there's still a lot we can learn in terms of incorporating to the dynamic guidance. But again, yeah, I mean, thank you so much for joining us today. I definitely hope we can have you back, because obviously there's a lot here and there's still a lot more to cover in future sessions. And finally, I just want to say that if there are more questions that come our way, please send them to info@knowledgeexchange.com. We'll make sure to get them to Nat Johnson. And we'll be posting all of our videos on the Knowledge Exchange YouTube channel. We'll be posting that here soon. And the link will be made available in our weekly MailChimp. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, Nat.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.